On May 2nd, Politico released a leaked 98-page draft opinion authored by Associate Justice Alito in an abortion case which had 5 votes to overturn Roe versus Wade. And since that time, we've seen a lot of analysis of what that means, as well as the Bans Off Our Bodies march on May 14th. And we know that Representative Eskamani is the perfect person to help us understand the impact of the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade. I first met Anna back in 2015 when the CFFC was volunteering at the downtown Planned Parenthood facility. In 2016, Anna made her first visit to the CFFC, and at that time she was the Senior Director of Public Affairs and the Field Operations for Planned Parenthood. She was so impassioned, so dynamic, and knowledgeable, it is no surprise that she is now a state representative in the Florida House. As a child, Anna went to public school in Orange County and then to the University of Central Florida, where she earned dual degrees as an undergrad and graduate student. She's now working on a PhD in public affairs. She ran for office for the first time in 2018 and made history as the first Iranian American elected to public office in Florida. I think another round of applause for that. In 2020, Representative Eskamani won her re-election by an overwhelming majority and has been championing issues such as economic justice, environmental protection, equality for all, funding for public schools, support of arts and culture, and the separation between church and state. And with a track record of kind sacrifice, endless hard work, ironclad values, Anna is known across the nation, not just Florida, now as a leader who is unbothered, unbossed, and committed to all of the people of Florida, no matter who they are. So please join me in welcoming Anna Eskamani.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. That was such a sweet and kind introduction, and it's great to be back, y'all. Like Jocelyn said, the last time I had the chance to speak to our Freethought community locally, I feel like I've seen many of you in different events and actions, but I have not actually had the chance to speak with you for several years. And yes, the last time I was here, I worked at Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida. And little did I know at that moment that I would run for office, becoming a first-time candidate and not only making history and just my cultural identity, but I would say in a very important way, we flipped the seat from red to blue and kept it that way in 2020. So I first just want to say welcome to District 47, because you are in it, and we're grateful to have you. Before I get started, I also want to acknowledge that today is a very special day for many reasons. It is Juneteenth, and so we honor the history of those who have fought for racial justice, and of course the fight that we still need to do and the work that we still have in front of us, despite the efforts of the Florida Legislature and our governor to erase that history and to ignore an oppressive past of our country, oftentimes driven by Christian nationalism. And then of course, it's Father's Day. So for any dads, whether you're a dad of dogs or cats or a dad of humans, we love you and appreciate you, and I'm grateful you spent the time to be with us today. And so there's a lot of familiar faces in the room, but there's also folks who I do not know. So I always love to start with very quick introductions, and then we'll dive into what's at stake for abortion access in Florida and across America. And so I came to this work with very humble beginnings. I'm the daughter of immigrants, as was mentioned. My parents came from 2 different parts of Iran, but met each other in Orlando. Yeah, so they didn't come together, they found each other. And my mom actually was working at the same donut shop as my dad, both in the service economy, just trying to make ends meet. And she recognized my dad's accent. And so she asked him what his origin was. He said Iran. They started speaking Persian. The rest was history. And so I have a big brother named Arya, who now lives in Miami with his wife, a twin sister named Anna Eskamani, who is a badass in her work as well. And my family did everything we could to achieve the American dream. We grew up in East Orlando, so the schools that I went to were in unincorporated Orange County, so from Bonneville Elementary School to Corn Lake Middle School, then University High School. And it was during that time where our family navigated a lot of different challenges, not just financial, where debt was a big challenge in my family and just paying our bills on time was a major stressor, My mom was diagnosed with cancer when I was about 9 years old, and it was a 4-year battle that eventually took her life. So she passed away when I was 13. And so a lot of what I do every single day is in her honor, is honoring those no longer with us through action. It's helping to build a world where parents don't lose their kids and kids don't lose their parents. But if you do find yourself in that situation, you have safety nets and support systems. And I would not be where I am today if it wasn't for the SSI that my dad was able to benefit from until me and my sister turned 18. If it wasn't for Bright Futures that got me to UCF and put me in a place where I did not have to have any debt when I finished my undergrad degrees. And of course, that put me in a position to get a job out of college at Planned Parenthood, which my Planned Parenthood story, like that of 1 in 5 American women, is as a patient. Because I grew up in a family without a mom, I didn't have a person I could really talk to about sexual health education or healthy decisions around relationships. And I had absence-only education in my school. And of course, it's kind of ironic to call absence-only education because it's the opposite. And what it actually does is often uses faith-focused approaches to teaching kids about sexual activity, stressing that if you don't practice abstinence, you're committing a sin. And literally, in my public high school, during this summer curriculum, our educator was a woman on stage who told us that, and then also asked each one of us to take a mint to make a commitment to her that we would not have sex before marriage. And so I totally did not take that mint. But it was one of those, moments for me as a young person of just, this is not empowering. This is actually really shaming, especially to anyone in the room who was sexually active, because unfortunately we're not preparing our kids to make informed decisions, and it's getting worse now. And so I actually found Planned Parenthood in search of answers, and made an appointment when I was 18 years old. I walked into the health center right by UCF by myself, the first ever medical appointment I had made as a young woman, and I left with a method of contraception that was right for me. And I realized at that moment, that experience I had was not the norm. Like, I was the exception. The fact that I was able to find Planned Parenthood, make an appointment in a state like Florida, where not only is there a difficulty in accessing health care, but there's not that many providers of contraception. And it's actually, there's been less over time because of the attacks that Planned Parenthood and abortion providers have faced in our state. So I kind of just fell into this work and started advocating for the issues most impacting women and girls, but also expanding to LGBTQ plus rights, economic justice, to the separation of church and state. And when I was at UCF, did many on-campus voter registration drives, and found myself offered a job at Planned Parenthood in 2012, which I was there for 6 years, really in the trenches here in Florida, in the legislature, fighting back against anti-abortion policies and policy makers. And so my decision to run for office was very much catalyzed by the 2016 election cycle. I just felt really discouraged by the direction that our country was going in. And not just the fact that at the time former President Trump had won, but the fact that Democrats lost. I was just shocked of how you could lose to, this type of character, right? But the reality was that as Democrats, we weren't offering a really good alternative. We weren't doing the work. We weren't helping folks understand that when you vote Democrat, your life improves. And that there's a self-interest that I think is a big part of the American identity. Folks often make decisions in this country based on what's good for me versus the collective good. But also as Democrats and as strong advocates, we should be able to help voters understand that when you support your self-interest, the collective good can also benefit. And especially on economic issues, when you are paid more, everyone else benefits, right? So things like the $15 minimum wage, things like environmental protection, corporate accountability, access to things like medical cannabis and recreational cannabis. Like, these are issues that are often maybe someone cares about for their own self-interest, but there's a collective good when we can achieve those policy goals. And the same applies to reproductive health, that in your self-interest, maybe you're not directly impacted by protecting abortion, especially if you don't have a uterus, but candidly, society benefits as a whole when those of us who do have the opportunity to make that choice can. I mean, you look at every data point around economic equity, around gender justice, and we see time and time again that contraception alongside abortion access has been transformational for the lives of women and pregnant people. And data tells us now that majority of Americans support access to a safe and legal abortion. But those that don't often carry a very archaic perception of gender, and they don't consider women to be equal. And unfortunately, much of this is also grounded again in that Christian nationalism I mentioned earlier. And so let's bring it to where we are today, right? So Florida is a very unique state in the Southeast when it comes to abortion access, because we have an enumerated right to privacy in our state constitution. So back in the 80s, Florida voters actually approved language in our state constitution to foundationally stress the importance of privacy rights. It explicitly says that Floridians have a right to privacy, have a right to live their life without government intrusion. So that is explicitly stated in the Constitution of Florida. It's not that clear in the federal Constitution, right? Because the protections granted to us to make personal decisions about our body is very much from case law, it's from precedent, versus the federal courts actually citing a specific language that states that. It's very much been enumerated from the constitutional language, but it's not explicitly stated compared to Florida. Which means we've been able to actually stop some of the most egregious and offensive abortion laws in the state from actually being enforced. So I'll give you a few examples. In my now 10 plus years in advocacy for reproductive justice, we've been able to stop, if not delay, policies like 24-hour mandatory delay. This is a policy that other states have that forces someone seeking to end a pregnancy to go to a medical facility, leave and come back at least 24 hours later. There's no reason for this. It's all designed to create systematic barriers, so folks who have transportation issues, folks who have challenges maybe with childcare, because remember, a large proportion of folks who end a pregnancy are actually already parents. And they're making that decision because they're trying to be a better parent for the kids they already have. And so you can imagine trying to end your pregnancy, the challenges you might face in finding childcare, transportation, and maybe even a hotel stay if the abortion provider is not close enough to you. So this was a law that passed back in 2015, but because of our right to privacy, it was litigated for 7 years. And I am sad to say that of April of 2022, the last judge who had this bill in front of her tossed it out, saying that the plaintiffs didn't have enough of a case against it. And so unfortunately, now Florida is also a 24-hour mandatory delay state. And so for all of our abortion providers here in Florida, they have to completely shift their operations, they have to schedule more providers. In Florida, you cannot access abortion by pill without going to a medical facility. So the FDA recently approved abortion by pill to be mailed to folks. And for those who don't know, there's typically 2 ways to access an abortion. Medication abortion is available for up to 10 weeks of gestational age. If you are unable to pursue that option, or if it's not your preference, you have the in-clinic procedure, which requires that health center experience. Some states now, you can have the abortion pill be mailed to you, and it's totally safe and effective, but Florida prohibits that. And I do suspect that Florida will actually make it even harder to access abortion by pill going into next session if our political climate does not change. So with that said, now in Florida, you have to go through this 24-hour delay, and it is causing already huge challenges for providers in meeting these bureaucratic and oftentimes religiously motivated restrictions. Now, with that said, we've also been able to stop large omnibus anti-abortion bills. TRAP laws are an example of this. So TRAP stands for Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers. This was the effort that Texas pursued back in, I think it was 2015, 2014 with Wendy Davis and the pink sneakers. Anyone remember that? Where there was Senator Wendy Davis, who has since run for many other offices, and she really is a phenomenal leader in Texas. And so she wore her pink sneakers doing a filibuster on the House floor in Texas. these trap laws are designed not to ban abortion, but to make it very hard to provide it by putting into place unnecessary regulations. So for example, your health center has to be an ambulatory surgical center. Not required to do so, but that type of requirement is very expensive. What ends up happening is that clinics automatically close because they're not ASC crafted. And actually, Planned Parenthood opened up a new-ish health center in Tallahassee a few years ago that is ASC because they're worried that if for some reason Florida were to try to pass, such a trap law, at least new health centers would meet those standards. But they're very expensive to construct and medically unnecessary. I think it's so important for us to remember with all these abortion restrictions that there's no leading medical organization that supports them, whether it's ACOG, which is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and actually recently AMA, the American Medical Association, who tends to be very conservative, passed a resolution saying that abortion is a human right. And it's a very, very big step for the AMA to do that. Yeah, we can applaud that for sure. But as American identity and American culture has evolved on abortion access, and also, this intersects with other collective rights. The leaked memo that Jocelyn mentioned that, I think for many Americans was a shock to see, mentions other cases that intersect with the right to privacy, including the ability to love who you want to love, including LGBTQ plus equality. And so we can't ignore the ripple effect of something like this. Back to my point about self-interest and collective good. We are seeing more and more stories, whether they're LGBTQ plus rights activists or even just hetero men, standing up and saying, I have something to lose in this too, because there's an understanding that the right to privacy to an abortion is not isolated. It absolutely is interconnected to all of our lives and all the collective rights and freedoms that many of us are proud to have fought for and grateful to live with in this country. And so this past legislative session, Florida passed House Bill 5, which is a 15-week abortion ban with no exceptions for rape, incest, or human trafficking. And those who pushed this bill forward knew very well that it was not constitutional, especially since at the time, we knew the Mississippi case, which is the 15-week ban, the Dobbs case that we're waiting for a decision to come out on any day now, was not decided yet. But despite that, my Republican colleagues still pushed through this bill, and despite our efforts to add amendments to put into place these exceptions, I filed several amendments to test the constitutionality of the law. It was all rejected in the Senate and the House. And the governor signed this bill at a church over in the Kissimmee area. And so, yeah, I think I heard someone laughing. I mean, again, it's like, those are your taxpayer dollars funding, not even a bill signing, but it really was a political rally at a church. I mean, it's just a complete disregard for what our founders had stressed to be a big part of our nation's identity, that separation of church and state. And so with that said, a lawsuit by the ACLU has been filed challenging House Bill 5. And actually another lawsuit was filed by a rabbi in South Florida speaking to religious concerns, because in the Jewish faith, the definition of personhood is different compared to perhaps other faiths. And so this rabbi is trying to sue alongside of his religious freedoms. And then the ACLU case is very much more focused on constitutionality and efforts to tie this abortion ban to a national agenda to ban abortion, which candidly, when I read that leaked SCOTUS case, of course I was incredibly angry, but I was not surprised, because none of us should be surprised. This is what they have wanted for decades now. And if you spend, one day outside a health center serving as a health center escort, which is where I met, David and Jocelyn back at Planned Parenthood, you can hear what the protesters are saying, and they're not isolated. There have been anti-abortion extremism trainings in Florida, and it's only going to get worse because we've actually seen the emergency calls out of abortion providers become more frequent and urgent in the last 5 years, because President Trump and others have emboldened these anti-abortion extremists to be much more aggressive and much more direct in what their demands are. And during the last legislative special session on property insurance, the gallery was full of folks from the anti-abortion movement who were trying to get Republican lawmakers to put into place an all-out abortion ban to mimic what Texas has done. And remember, Texas not only has banned abortion at 6 weeks, but they have avoided any type of legal intervention, because the enforcement mechanism in Texas is not the state is the enforcer, your neighbor is the enforcer. And so they've created this vigilante system in Texas now that if you know someone is trying to end an abortion after 6 weeks, not only can you report that, but you are financially awarded for reporting that. And so because of that structure, they've been able to avoid our now very conservative Supreme Court from intervening. So Texas has had abortion essentially banned because most folks don't know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. And then you had this huge disbursement of patients trying to go in other places, right? So Oklahoma became the #1 option for many patients in Texas. So what did Oklahoma just do? They banned abortion. Oklahoma just passed one of the most extreme abortion bans, an all-out abortion ban. The first country in the first state in this country to do that. And of course, meanwhile, we're waiting for the Supreme Court of the United States to put out their final decision. And Tuesday will be a decision day this week, and Thursday will be as well. So where does that leave us in Florida, and where does that leave us as those who are committed to this work? And I'm going to give what I hope to be some calls to action, a little bit of hope in what I know feels like a very disparate moment, and then I want to take questions and see what's on your mind, because that's really why I'm here, is to hear what your ideas are, what your concerns are. But Florida has yet to draw a decision on abortion based on our state constitution. So these lawsuits that I mentioned will make a decision with the Florida State Supreme Court on their interpretation of that right to privacy clause and how it intersects with abortion access. This is the first lawsuit where we are asking that question. And so it's going to be very, very important for the future of our state to get an answer to that question. Of course, Governor DeSantis has appointed many conservative members to the state Supreme Court as well, and so I don't want to, be too rosy about what the outcome could be, but I will say the right to privacy is so explicitly stated that the Supreme Court of Florida has to consider that, and so we don't know what that outcome will be, but we will have an answer, and hopefully we'll at least receive what's called injunctive relief before July 1st. July 1st is when Florida's 15-week abortion ban goes into place. So the goal is that with these lawsuits, we'll at least get injunctive relief, which means the bill will not be implemented until litigation is over. And that might be able to at least give the people of Florida and those in the Southeast more time, because as y'all know, there are 20-some states that have these trigger laws, which means as soon as SCOTUS drops a decision, if it completely dismantles Roe v. Wade, those states will ban abortion overnight. And so you're going to continue to see patients who need resources and need other places to go. With that said, abortion funds have become essential in this moment. So abortion funds are nonprofit organizations that essentially raise money to help pay for not just the procedure, but those other barriers I mentioned: transportation, childcare, hotel stays. So we are blessed in Florida with several abortion funds. Our local one here is called Florida Access Network, or FAN. And the outpouring of support has been remarkable. But we have to continue to support our abortion funds to ensure that when they get a call from someone who's navigating the new government-created barriers, that they can have a path to access this procedure and express bodily autonomy and make that personal decision for themselves and their loved ones. But there's also this larger political fight, and also even just like persuasive communications we have to lead on, as advocates who care about this. If you noticed, I never once used the term pro-choice or pro-life, because believe it or not, despite those terms being very popular in different political spaces, they don't reflect the majority perspective of Americans. 10 years ago, Americans were already telling us through different research and polling that they didn't align with those labels. They do agree that abortion should remain safe and legal, and that has been the dominant feeling in Florida and around the country, but the labels don't reflect the nuance of this personal decision. So when I talk about abortion, I always frame it as that personal medical decision between that person, their family, their doctor, their faith, and not politicians. And when you frame it in that way, it also allows there to be a deeper conversation on bodily autonomy, on someone's destiny and planning a pregnancy, and it also can open up the door for more storytelling. Because right now, 1 in 4 American women have had an abortion in this country, and they should not feel shame or stigma. They should be loved and supported. And we can't change the stigma that surrounds abortion, which makes it easier to attack abortion, unless we share our stories and we create an environment where people are comfortable to share their stories. And a part of that too is moving away from the political labels and focusing on our values, on why we care about this issue, because it's about freedom. It's about making a decision about what your family looks like. It's about your personal faith, if you are a person of faith. Many people who have an abortion identify as people of faith, and they're making a decision with their conversation, right? To whether it's a religious figure or leader, and they're not talking to politicians about it. And we should not be allowing for a dominant group of extreme activists to dictate the direction of what my pregnancy looks like or what the outcome will be. And so with that said, I really stress to folks that we have to be more bold in talking about abortion. You gotta say the A word. A lot of folks don't want to say it either, and I get so frustrated at political events where I hear politicians use every title but abortion. And it's you're not going to break the stigma if you're scared to say it, right? And then on top of that, center the advocacy on those who are impacted. When it comes to any type of abortion ban, of course, every person has some degree of impact. But those who are going to suffer the most are people who don't have money, are people who are undocumented, are communities of color, are folks who might face a disability. Those are the folks who are either not going to be able to express this personal decision, or worse, they're going to, probably equally worse, they're going to potentially hurt themselves, right? In trying to find an outlet for that decision. And I want to stress too that there's been a growth of folks advocating for self-managed abortion care. This has been an effort, like I said, with the abortion pill being more readily available to help folks in these different situations end a pregnancy on their own terms. But the flip side of that is the criminalization of people who make that decision. So there has been an effort to get a commitment from district attorneys and state attorneys to not criminalize someone for ending their own pregnancy. Because we're creating an environment where, to some degree, people don't have a choice but to take matters in their own hands. And there was the arrest of a woman in Texas who ended her own pregnancy and ended up in a hospital because of bleeding. And the police in Texas, after the hospital staff reported her, arrested her. And fortunately, the district attorney did not pursue charges, and she was released. But imagine that trauma on top of trauma onto trauma, right? And again, it's all based on the fact that there are people out there who don't think women are equal, who don't think pregnant people are equal, who look at us as vessels and do not look at us as individual beings who can make personal decisions about our destiny. And we have to stress this control aspect, because that's ultimately what this is about. It is about controlling my ability to decide when I want to parent. And reproductive health rights are the common communication stressors in different political spaces. When we talk about reproductive rights, that's when we talk about the legal right to make these decisions. Reproductive health is referring to where are clinics located, where can folks find access in their neighborhoods. But I really stress for us to follow with the values of reproductive justice. Because remember, reproductive justice, which was coined by Black women in the 90s, is a term that doesn't just speak to the ability to have a child or not have a child. It's also about the environment to raise your child. The ability to raise your child in an environment conducive to their health and well-being. And for many mothers today, there is no justice. Whether they can't access prenatal, postnatal care, or they can't access healthcare for themselves, or their child is much more likely to experience police brutality or other types of systematic barriers to a good education and so forth. And so I always challenge folks too to think about this issue from the framework of justice, because it also allows us to build relationships with untraditional allies to find a path forward that goes beyond Roe. Because Roe v. Wade was never the ceiling, it was the floor. Even today, with Roe v. Wade as the law of the land, there are millions of people who don't have access to make a personal decision about their body. And there's all the barriers we already talked about that create those disparities. And so we do have to go beyond Roe, but of course, these next few weeks are going to be challenging. And I want to mention one last thing before I open for questions. A lot of us are processing this SCOTUS decision as worst case scenario. And I understand why, because of the leaked SCOTUS case was absolutely the worst case scenario. Complete dismantling of Roe v. Wade, and also a mention of other rights that Justice Alito does not consider to be real rights. I mean, that is stated in his draft opinion. But to be clear, if the outcome is a not as extreme loss, it is still a loss. And another level of loss could be that a 15-week abortion ban is allowed, but anything less than that is not, right? So they basically change the metric of viability. Because right now, what the Supreme Court has held up from 15 different justices of diverse political affiliations is states cannot impede on abortion access before viability. And viability is typically dictated to be around that 22, 23 week mark. And so if we shift that criteria of viability to 15 weeks based purely on religious perspective, which is what these current Supreme Court justices have asked questions about during the oral arguments, and their history tells us they're very much making this decision on a religious perspective and not one of science, that's still a loss for us, right? And we have to fight back. We can't fight back a little less hard because it's not as bad. And this is something I experience in the legislature all the time, where Governor DeSantis will paint a picture of what bill he wants, and the legislature does a version that it's still really bad, but not as bad, and people get a little wishy-washy, and they're like, oh, well, it could be worse. No, this is already bad. And you still need to be outraged by it, and you still have to organize and activate around it. And we can't just settle, with something that is not as bad. Like, it's still bad, and they're going to come back and make it worse again. Like, with this SCOTUS decision, when it drops, whether it's going to be the worst case scenario or a level of worse, there's 6-week abortion bans and abortion bans moving through the process, y'all. It's going to take 2-3 more years for them to get to SCOTUS, but they will get to SCOTUS. And so we can't rest. Like, we can't celebrate a less harsh decision. We have to activate ourselves. And that's why, our team is ready. We're not only supporting abortion funds and doing voter registration and talking about this everywhere, but we're also pointing out the fact of how quiet our Republican colleagues are. And that's not a coincidence. When the leak happened, all the noise coming from the Republican Party was about the leak itself, not what was in the leak. And the reason why is that they know this victory for them is not popular. And there's a reason why Governor DeSantis did a 15-week abortion ban and has been very quiet on anything after that. It's because they know that politically this is not popular, but they're doing it through thousands of cuts in a slow burn. So before you know it, the everyday person is trying to access an abortion and realizes at that moment what the state has done. And we don't want to get to that point. We have to make sure that more people are connected and aware of what's at stake and have a sense of efficacy in fighting back. And so with that, I'm going to step back. But again, I want to say thank you so much for having me. And I really hope that a part of what we've been able to talk about today is inspiring folks to not lose hope, but to actually realize that the antidote to despair is action. And so we can't despair, we can't slow down, we have to keep fighting. So thank you again.
From religion